2022 was a milestone in US-Türkiye relations. From the F-16 fighter jets deal to dialogue on regional issues, Turkey found common ground to strengthen relations with its NATO ally. Despite raising concerns about Turkey's stance against Sweden and Finland's NATO bids, tensions with Greece and cross-border operations in Syria, the Biden administration showed it's willing to find solutions to address Ankara's security concerns. Let's take a look at this report.
2022 created an opening for the longtime NATO allies. Since Russia began its attack on Ukraine on February 24, Ankara has emerged as a major power broker and peacemaker between Moscow and the West.
Temennimiz itidal ve sağduyunun galip gelmesi, silahların bir an önce susmasıdır.
After a frosty start during the first year of Biden's presidency, 2022 saw Washington and Ankara work closer together. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his US counterpart Joe Biden held two meetings this year during a NATO summit in Spain in June and recently in Bali for the G20. Biden thanked Erdogan for his mediation efforts that led to the resumption of grain shipments from Ukraine and voiced support for the sale of F-16s, citing their importance to Turkey and NATO's defenses.
We should sell them the F-16 jets and modernize those jets as well.
The drawn-out battle over selling fighter jets to Ankara started back in 2019. Turkey's acquisition of Russia's S-400 defense system triggered US sanctions, including its removal from the F-35 fighter jet program. Ankara, which had already paid $1.4 billion for the fifth-generation aircraft, called on the White House to provide an alternative. In 2021, Turkey proposed buying dozens of F-16 fighter jets and modernization kits from the US as a compromise. But the purchase faced a number of obstacles in Congress. That was until October, when the Senate removed two amendments to the US defense bill, which had previously restricted F-16 sales to Turkey. On December 15th, the Senate passed the $858 billion Defense Act, sending it to President Biden's desk and a step closer to closing the fighter jet deal. But Biden's public support for Turkey's defense needs hasn't always translated into action. In May, Greece extended an agreement that gives US troops greater access to its military bases. Less than a week later, Greece's Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis addressed a joint session of Congress where he called on US lawmakers not to approve the F-16 deal with Turkey. Throughout the year, Turkey has raised concerns about Greece's militarization of islands in the Eastern Aegean Sea. In September, pictures reportedly showed dozens of US armored vehicles being deployed to Lesbos and Samos near Turkey's western coast. Erdogan slammed the move, saying Turkey will utilize all means to protect its interests. But the main dividing issue between Ankara and Washington has been US support for terror groups operating along Turkey's border. First used as pretext to fight Daesh, the US continues to support the PKK offshoot YPG in northern Syria, despite strong objections from Ankara. Several hundred US troops remain in the area and conduct regular patrols with the YPG. In late November, in response to a terror attack in Istanbul, Turkey launched a cross-border operation Close Sword. In a statement, the Pentagon called for de-escalation and expressed strong opposition to the new Turkish military operation in Syria. But Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar emphasized that only terrorists are being hit, and that Turkey would never target coalition forces or civilians. The year started off with promise after Russia's attack on Ukraine united NATO to a level not seen in years. But ties between Turkey and the US hit familiar roadblocks, and many are waiting to see if 2023 will bring a breakthrough in those differences or more of the same.
And to further discuss the future of relations between Turkey and the US, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is former US diplomat William Lawrence, and from Ankara is Tudor Onea. He's an assistant professor at Bilkent University. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. So, William, could you walk us through the most important developments in Turkey-US relations this past year? I mean, if you were to take a stock of relations, what would you say?
Well, unfortunately, for a more direct bilateral relationship based on the two countries' long history of working with each other and what they need directly from each other, it's really been driven by Ukraine more than everything else. So everything, good that Turkey's doing has to do with, NATO, helping with the NATO enlargement, the grain deal, the other negotiations related to the Ukraine war, et cetera, et cetera. And all the negatives also have to do with Turkey's ongoing dialogue with Russia, and despite its policy of positive neutrality, positive pro-Ukraine neutrality, it's often seen in the U.S. as too close to Russia, making too many concessions to Russia, and of course the issue of the S-400s is not off the table yet.
Yes.
In terms of the most pressing needs. There's a role for the White House. There's a role for Congress. Senator Menendez in the Senate is, very pro-Greece. So there's that whole aspect of things. There are many important issues on the table going forward. But, insofar as Turkey's helping with Ukraine, I think that will help smooth out a lot of the other issues.
So how would you define relations, Tudor? I mean, in previous year, we've seen ups and downs. Is this bumpy trend likely to continue this year?
Probably. My suspicion here, I mean, when it comes to Turkey and the United States, the two need each other at the end of the day. So it's a little bit like a squabbling family, and ever so often one of the members says, okay, I'm going to leave, and, exits by slamming the door, but they always come back. And I believe that this is going to happen this year as well. In fact, it might be even a year of reconciliation. We will see how it goes. There are several things that are likely to happen. There's, of course, the situation that, William has mentioned regarding the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. But there's also really the question of what's going on in Syria, where we are approaching the end game. And it's probably decision time. How the United States is going to deal with this decision is going to very much affect relations with Ankara in the coming year.
So, William, by attacking Ukraine, do you think Russia has drawn a wedge between Ankara and Washington? And what kind of a balancing act Turkey is striking since February when Russia started its attack on Ukraine?
I think Russia drew a wedge by the sale of the S-400s and by supporting the Turkish economy more than its invasion of Ukraine. In fact, I think the invasion of Ukraine is quite the opposite. I think it's caused a little bit of a beginning of a rapprochement because Turkey has been so helpful on certain files regarding Ukraine. But in terms of where things are going forward, I agree very much with what the other guest said. But all of these issues are complicated. And just to give you an issue, since you brought up Syria, the U.S. largely agrees with Turkey when it comes to northwestern Syria and disagrees with Turkey when it comes to northeastern Syria. And so even the Syria question is not a simple one.
Yeah, that was one of my questions because, William, we know both Russia and the U.S. are on the opposing sides on many issues. But when it comes to Turkey's anti-terror operations in northern Syria, they seem to be on the same page. Why do you think it is like that?
Well, ultimately, the U.S. agrees with Turkey when it comes to homeland security, when it comes to securing its borders, when it comes to going after terrorists. I think when the disagreement begins is when Turkey's wariness towards Kurdish groups beyond just terrorism gets in the way of other things. And this has played out most importantly in terms of the Finnish and Swedish support for Kurdish refugees, right? Kurdish diaspora, that sort of thing, which then bleeds into this conversation of, which Kurds are supporting terrorism and which aren't. And I think there are some disagreements. And also, when the enemy of the enemy is my friend, when the U.S. was looking for allies against Assad, they did team up with Kurds in northeastern Syria who are linked to groups, terror groups in some ways, not engaged those particular people in terrorism on Turkish soil, but linked to them. And so this will be part of the complex negotiation. Turkey and the U.S. do intelligence sharing. They do name names when it comes to threats from Kurdish individuals involved in terrorism. As far as the overall geopolitical aspects, that's more where the disagreement is. And I think again, it'll be bumpy, but things can be worked out over time.
So, Tudor, why hasn't the US, you think, been able to root out the Daesh terror organization throughout these years? And does it still give a convenient excuse for the YPG presence in the region?
It's not a convenience excuse. It's a problem that, the United States wants to solve, but the problem is it doesn't want to solve it by doing the sort of thing that it has done in Iraq. Meaning having its own boots on the ground. So it needs to depend on some local actor to actually be there and police the area and control the area. Now, the question here, of course, it has done so by relying on the IPG, but the question is, does it need to continue to do that? Mm-hmm. And if not the IPG, then what would be the replacement for that? We are talking essentially in the context of a very likely incoming Turkish military intervention in Syria. And the question here is not so much, all right, Turkey intervenes, it cracks down on what it sees as Kurdish terrorists, and well, there might be some disagreement on the United States side. But the problem here is what happens after. I mean, say Turkey then pulls back. So what happens? Do the Kurds come back? And if not the Kurds, then who gets control over this area? We are also having some very interesting negotiations, which have taken place in these last few weeks between Turkey and the governments of Syria and of Russia.
Yes.
So it might be quite interesting to see if this might not play as a great bargain and a great normalization where, Assad makes a comeback as, regular statesman, and we might even see a summit of three presidents, Putin, Assad, and President Erdogan.
I think it's not all about the Kurds there, Tudor, because this latest negotiations between the three countries were also, they also took up the return of the refugees, which are in Turkey and number about 5 million. So, William, what does the U.S. administration make of Turkey's normalization efforts with most of the Middle Eastern countries, as well as Syria, with which, as we all know, had been at odds for the last decade?
Well, it's complicated, right? The U.S. Appreciates Turkey's efforts to make friends again with all of its longstanding friends with whom relationships have soured, whether Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Israel. But on the other hand, the U.S. has agreed largely with Turkey's pro-democracy moves, whether in Libya or Syria or elsewhere. And when you were talking about Syria a minute ago, I was thinking, well, northwestern Syria isn't only about Kurds only. And who will govern the Kurds, right, if they're not under Syrian control, and after this pullout that your other guest was hypothesizing about. So these are really, really complicated issues with no simple solutions. And I think a very important piece of this will be not only open communication channels between Turkey and the United States, which are sometimes better than others, but also more attention paid to Turkey by Washington. Biden did have that unscheduled meeting in November with Erdogan and did move the chess pieces forward in terms of improving the relationship. But there'll need to be constant contact to coordinate on all of these complex issues.
So, meanwhile, Tudor, in May, right after Russia's attack on Ukraine, Finland and Sweden have left their decades of neutrality in a bid to join NATO and pledged harsher anti-terror laws on their soil. So it seems at the moment both candidates have not fully addressed Turkey's security concerns. So could Turkey delay voting until after elections?
That would be probably a risky strategy. I would say that, because there have been, particularly on the Finnish end, efforts to address Turkey's concerns. This should also be acknowledged, and also the more you wait, the more you get impatient. And there is already, as you know, as William has suggested, there is always also already some degree of impatience with Turkey and its resistance to accepting these countries into NATO. Perhaps one possibility might be to have maybe a differentiated stance and to say, okay, Finland can join, but we are still not satisfied with Sweden. We are still pursuing negotiations, and so this might still be happening. And of course, it's quite interesting because the whole Finland-Sweden in NATO deal is also tied, and in almost every single declaration that I have seen, with the F-16 issues.
Yes.
And so if it's pretty much a sort of it's not quite a side deal, but it's essentially something that can be settled on its own. So you accept Finland and Sweden, and then the deal goes on and without any types of limitations or conditions on how to use the planes.
So, William, what do you think? What would such a delay mean for the alliance, of course, and as well as the Turkey-US relations?
Well, first of all, I agree with everything that was said, but it is true Sweden and Finland said they either come in together or they don't come in. But I could still see along the lines of what your other guest said, maybe a step-by-step coming in where Finland's coming in with Sweden on its tails, in a two-step process within a one-step process. It is linked to the F-16 issue. Certainly, the more that's done sooner, the better. But all of these issues are increasingly interlinked. I think, again, it's going to come down to not only the Turkish-Washington negotiation, but the Washington negotiation. It is true that the U.S. did not make the F-35 sale, and the feeling at the time was, okay, well, then they'll get the F-16s. But the same issues that the U.S. was unhappy about that led to the F-35 issue is now affecting the F-16 issue. And if I may, I just separate between the modernization of the existing fleet, which I think is a much easier sell to Congress than the sale of the 80 new planes, which again, Congress would like to attach to other issues, including the Greece, Aegean Island issue and all that. So I really believe that the best way to get to yes on all sides is greater attention paid to these issues, these quid pro quos, public agreements, private agreements, moving things forward. And frankly, notwithstanding everything we all agree on, the more help with Ukraine, the more it affects all the other issues positively.
So I was actually going to ask you this, William. I mean, could you detail the mood in the Congress? I mean, is the bipartisan anti-Turkey perception still dominant in U.S. policy circles, or has it changed, as you've just mentioned, with Turkey's mediating role in the Ukraine conflict?
Turkey's not that popular in the U.S. Congress. They're respected as a member of NATO and because of the long history and other factors, but they're not that respected in Congress for a number of reasons I could get into. Just like the United States, if you look at Turkish polling data, isn't that popular. Whereas, in the U.S., Turkey as a country is more popular than it is in Congress. But I think the mood is one to help Biden, given a now divided Congress. So even though there will be protesting on a number of issues in Congress, ultimately the Democratic-controlled Senate and the Democrats in the House are going to try to help Biden have some foreign policy wins. And that means ultimately supporting Biden's policy with Turkey after some of these issues are ironed out further.
So apart from northern Syria and F-16 deal, Tudor, how has the U.S.'s extended military presence in Greece, as well as the Athens militarization of islands so close to Turkey, added to the tensions at sea between Ankara and Athens?
Well, it certainly hasn't improved, right? Each side's perception of each other. And this was already tense. It's a tense relation. And so this hasn't really contributed to making things any better. Now, from the position of the United States, as far as I understand, this is pretty much an effort because, the United States has bigger concerns. Number one concern being, of course, the war in Ukraine, and almost, I would probably say, at the same level. So two to say one, would be essentially relations with China. So pretty much when it comes to Turkey, the idea here is you try to keep it not to rock the boat, not to create further problems, further issues, and then become a further headache. And relations with Greece, at least from the point of view of the United States, are to be blamed, and the deterioration and the tension in there are to be blamed on Ankara. Whether this is correct or not, it's another story. But definitely what we have here is this sort of almost isolation of Ankara in the context of the East Mediterranean Gas Forum, yes. Which is a regional organization also endorsed by France, now by Italy, and now by the United States. However, there is maybe a silver lining to all of this. Maybe because now we have a increased security commitment on the part of the United States for Greece, maybe Greece will calm down. And if indeed there is no actual threat from the Turkish side, then this might actually improve relations, because you don't have to feel so nervous when you can start negotiating. And when, once you calm down and you realize that, Turkey, yes. Turkey doesn't mean to invade you, then you can actually start negotiating about, maritime rights and energy exploitation and all of these other issues.
So Greece just recently threatened to increase its territorial waters from 6 nautical miles to 12, which is considered as a carcass belly. But what kind of a balancing act here does the U.S. strike in the long-running disputes between Ankara and Athens, William, in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean?
Unfortunately, it's somewhat a factor of lobbies. So the Greek lobby, both within Congress and generally in the United States, is significantly stronger than the Turkish lobby. There's some, improvements that Turkey could make there in terms of its lobbying efforts in Washington. I personally am very sympathetic to Turkey's position vis-a-vis the islands and vis-a-vis the continental shelf, and how far these maritime rights extend. I'm also not particularly concerned about Turkish gas exploration or its gas deal with Libya, often which are hyperbolized in Washington. So I'm part of that conversation here as well. But I think ultimately, if you look carefully at international maritime law, the devil is in the details of the negotiations, not within the law. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, what happens in the Aegean and what happens in the wider sea ultimately is a factor of Greek-Turkish negotiations, notwithstanding NATO's role and the EU's role and all that. They ultimately have to decide what concessions they make to the other because of that proximity, that historical geographic proximity between the countries, with the Greek control of all of those islands so close to Turkish coast and Turkish waters.
So, Tudor, do you believe that Turkey and the US still share overarching threats or interests?
I definitely think so. Yes, it's not just the fact that they are both members of NATO, and in fact some of the bigger ones. But it's also the fact that they are sharing the same interests in the case of Ukraine and mm-hmm. of Russia. And I would say when it comes to Turkish neutrality, this is probably far more tilted towards Ukraine than it is understood by Western media. I would also say that there are also common interests regarding Syria, regarding the Middle East. And of course, there are differences, right? And probably the biggest demand that is on the table is dealing with the IPG, at least from the Turkish side. For the United States is pretty much leave the IPG alone to do its business in making sure that ISIS doesn't come back.
Yes.
That is the biggest difference. If this difference is, however, being solved, then a lot of the other problems, I believe, will become far more manageable. The S-400s, yes. The F-16s, everything else will, I believe, fall into place. And maybe this is the year in which, everything will fall into place.
do you agree with Tudor, William? I mean, will this year bring any breakthroughs to settle those differences, or things will get tenser due to the ongoing Ukraine conflict?
I'm sure we'll have some of both. I'm sure we'll have some moments of greater tension and some moments of greater rapprochement. I do agree that just as the top issue for the U.S. is Ukraine, and many things flow from that, the top issue is terrorism, terrorist threats coming from the YPG and linked groups that are threatening Turkish soil and Turkish citizens. It was noted among Turkey watchers in the U.S., although not the wider U.S. public, that there was some blame for the U.S. after the bombings in Istanbul, which I think is misplaced, but representative of the overall tension in the relationship.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.